They thought the war ended when the guns went silent, but for the Sherman tank, that silence was only the sound of a door opening. In the spring of 1945, across Europe's shattered countryside and the steaming islands of the Pacific, thousands of Sherman tanks sat motionless. Their engines were cold for the first time in years. Their armor still carried the smell of oil, burned paint, and cordite. Some were parked neatly in rows, others frozen forever where they had last fought, angled awkwardly in ditches or beside ruined buildings. Crews climbed out for the final time, slinging duffel bags over tired shoulders, some patting the steel hull like a farewell to a stubborn friend. Most believed the Sherman's story had reached its final page. What none of them could see was that the tank was only changing chapters. Victory left behind a battlefield that felt unreal. Roads once choked with armor, and supply trucks were suddenly quiet. Airfields that had buzzed day and night stood empty except for the wind. Sherman tanks lined hedgerows, beaches, and city streets, their long guns pointing at nothing. Some bore crude field repairs, welding scars layered over older scars, bent fenders and mismatched road wheels telling stories of survival. Others looked almost untouched, having arrived too late to fight. To soldiers walking past them, these tanks were reminders of fear, endurance, and luck. To officers and planners, they were something colder and simpler. Inventory. The United States had produced the Sherman in numbers the world had never seen before. Factories had run day and night, turning out tanks with relentless efficiency. Quantity had been the strategy. Reliability had been the goal. By the time the war ended, tens of thousands existed scattered across continents. Now that same success created a problem. The U.S. Army did not need an army-sized fleet of tanks in peacetime. Budgets were shrinking. Public attention was shifting away from war. Entire depots overflowed with armored vehicles that no longer had a clear purpose. Rail yards filled with olive-drab hulls waiting for orders that never came. Ports were crowded with Shermans unloaded from ships that would not sail back with them anytime soon. In Europe, some tanks were parked on the edges of towns like strange metal statues, drawing curious civilians who cautiously approached, touching the cold steel as if to confirm the nightmare was truly over. Children climbed onto hulls, pretending to be commanders, unaware that only we, earlier real men, had sat there wondering if they would live another hour. For some Shermans, the end came quickly and without ceremony. Tanks that had burned out completely, been ripped open by heavy guns, or drowned in rivers were deemed beyond saving. Bulldozers dragged them to scrap fields. Torches cut through armor plate that had once deflected bullets and shrapnel. Turrets were lifted off and set aside like severed heads. It was a brutal, unromantic ending for machines that had crossed beaches under fire and fought through cities reduced to rubble. Yet even here, the Sherman did not vanish entirely. Its steel would be melted down and reborn as bridges, beams, tools, and rail lines, quietly supporting the peace it had helped make possible. Most Shermans, however, were far too valuable to destroy. Instead, they entered a strange limbo. Engines were drained, weapons greased, openings sealed against dust and moisture. Rows of tanks were parked in open fields, depots, and deserts, stretching farther than the eye could see. In the American Southwest, Shermans baked under the sun, their silhouette casting long shadows like frozen convoys marching nowhere. In Europe, they sat beneath gray skies, slowly gathering rust, waiting for a future no one could clearly describe. The world after World War II was not calm. It was exhausted, unstable, and uneasy. Cities lay in ruins. Nations were bankrupt. Old empires were collapsing, and new borders were being drawn by people who barely understood the lands they divided. Armies still existed, but few countries could afford to design and build modern tanks from scratch. What they needed were weapons that worked, that could be obtained quickly, and that came with proven reliability. The Sherman fit that need perfectly. Allied nations that had used Shermans during the war wanted to keep them. Some negotiated purchases, others received them as aid. Newly formed or newly threatened countries saw the Sherman as a way to build armored forces almost overnight. One by one, tanks were pulled from storage, inspected, repaired, and loaded onto ships. As they left American ports, their identity began to shift. White stars were painted over. New insignia appeared. Serial numbers changed. Manuals were translated into unfamiliar languages. The Sherman was no longer just an American tank. It was becoming a global one. Inside these tanks, new crews learned the same lessons American crews had learned years earlier. They discovered the way the engine vibrated through the hull, how the suspension groaned over rough ground, how the turret felt when it swung quickly or slowly. Different languages echoed inside the same steel walls. Different flags flew above the same machine. Yet, the tank itself remained unchanged, carrying the physical memory of its design wherever it went. Back in the United States, military thinkers were already looking beyond the Sherman. The war had exposed its limitations as clearly as its strengths. It was dependable, easy to maintain, and adaptable. But it was no longer cutting edge. New tanks promised heavier armor and more powerful guns. The Sherman was being quietly pushed aside from the spotlight. Still, no one could deny its usefulness. Rather than discard it, the Army began finding new roles. Some Shermans had their turrets removed and were converted into recovery vehicles. Instead of firing shells, they now pulled damaged tanks out of mud and ditches during training exercises. Others were transformed into engineering machines. Bulldozer blades replaced guns. Cranes rose where turrets once sat. Bridge-laying variants appeared, capable of turning a tank into a moving piece of infrastructure. In these forms, the Sherman stopped destroying and started building, lifting and rescuing. It became a tool rather than a weapon. This transformation gave the tank a strange second identity. Soldiers who worked with these modified Shermans no longer saw them as symbols of combat. They were reliable workhorses, trusted machines that rarely failed. The tank that had once been criticized for its battlefield weaknesses now earned respect for its flexibility. It adapted to whatever role was demanded, just as it had during the war. Yet peace was fragile. As alliances shifted and tensions grew, old weapons began to matter again. Warehouses that felt like museums one year became active armories the next. Shermans that had not moved in years were awakened. Mechanics worked through checklists written during another era, coaxing engines back to life. Fuel flowed again. Tracks turned. The tank that many assumed would quietly fade away was being called back, not because it was the best, but because it was available. For veterans who witnessed this, the sight was unsettling. The Sherman was tied to memories they could not escape. Friends lost, nights under fire, the constant fear that the next hit would be the last, seeing the same tank sent out again. Sometimes to places they had never even heard of during the war, felt like watching history refuse to stay buried. The steel hulls carried echoes of shouted commands and muffled explosions, even when the new crews inside knew nothing of those stories. By the late 1940s, it was clear that the Sherman's post-war life would be longer and more complicated than anyone in 1945 had imagined. It was no longer simply a weapon of a single global conflict. It had become a commodity, a teaching tool, a symbol of military aid, and a reminder of industrial power. It existed simultaneously as surplus and necessity, as outdated and indispensable. In some places, Shermans were used to train new generations of soldiers who had never seen combat. These crews learned basic armored tactics, maintenance skills, and teamwork inside a tank that had already proven itself under fire. The Sherman became a classroom on tracks, its worn controls polished smooth by countless hands. Instructors trusted it, because they knew it would start, run, and forgive mistakes. In other places, Sherman sat quietly as reserve forces, waiting behind fences and undertops. They were insurance policies, machines held in case the world tipped back into chaos. Their presence alone carried meaning. To some nations, owning Shermans signaled alignment, security, or survival. The tank had become political as well as practical. They believed the Sherman's journey after storage would be quiet, but instead it rolled straight back into history. As the late 1940s unfolded, the tank re-emerged not as a forgotten relic, but as a familiar solution to unfamiliar problems. Nations rebuilding shattered armies needed strength fast, and the Sherman offered something rare: certainty. It had already proven it could survive mud, sand, snow, and fire. When crates of spare parts followed it across oceans, the tank arrived not alone but as a complete system. For many countries, receiving Shermans felt like inheriting experience itself, compressed into steel and bolts. In Europe, the Sherman helped patch together defenses in a continent still bleeding. Countries that had been occupied rebuilt armies from fragments, and the tank gave them a backbone. It trained new crews who had grown up during bombings and rationing men who knew war only as civilians. The Sherman became their first teacher. Its controls were forgiving, its behavior predictable. Mistakes did not always mean death. That mattered in a world desperate to avoid repeating catastrophe. The tank carried scars of one war, while preparing soldiers for another they prayed would never come. Across the Atlantic, American depots emptied and refilled as Shermans cycled through inspection lines. Mechanics replaced worn components, upgraded radios, and standardized parts. Some tanks received new engines, quieter and safer than the originals. Others gained improved suspensions or modified armor layouts. These were not dramatic transformations, but practical ones, meant to stretch usefulness rather than chase perfection. The Sherman became a platform instead of a final design, endlessly adaptable, endlessly serviceable. Each modification extended its relevance, pushing its retirement further into an uncertain future. Then the world cracked again. In 1950, the Korean Peninsula erupted, and the Sherman was suddenly relevant in combat once more. Tanks pulled from storage found themselves shipped to another war entirely. Snow replaced sand. Hills replaced hedgerows. Yet the Sherman adapted again. Crews learned to fight in brutal cold, engines groaning as oil thickened and metal shrank. Against new enemy armor, the Sherman was no longer dominant, but it was reliable. It climbed slopes, supported infantry, and endured punishment that broke lesser machines. For soldiers in Korea, the Sherman felt both old and comforting. Veterans recognized its silhouette immediately. Newer crews learned quickly why it had earned respect. It might not have been the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but it arrived on time, worked as expected, and stayed running when supply lines stretched thin. In that war, reliability mattered as much as raw strength. The Sherman once again proved that being dependable could be the difference between holding ground and losing it. Beyond Korea, the Sherman spread across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In deserts, it received filters and modifications to cope with dust and heat. In jungles, it moved cautiously through narrow paths, its engine echoing beneath thick canopies. Different nations adapted it to local needs, sometimes combining parts from multiple variants into hybrid machines that never existed on American assembly line. These Shermans were unique, shaped by necessity rather than doctrine, each one telling a story of adaptation. Some countries upgraded their Shermans aggressively. Bigger guns replaced original cannons. New fire control systems improved accuracy. Extra armor plates were welded onto hulls in improvised patterns. Purists might have scoffed, but these changes kept the tank competitive far longer than expected. The Sherman's original design allowed such experimentation. It accepted upgrades without losing balance, a rare trait that engineers quietly admired. The tank became proof that good foundations mattered more than flashy innovation. Other Shermans lived quieter lives. They guarded airfields, trained reservists, or stood ready behind borders that never ignited. Crews maintained them carefully, even lovingly, because replacement options were limited. For these soldiers, the Sherman was not outdated, it was trusted. Familiarity bred confidence. When alarms sounded during tense political moments, crews climbed into machines they knew intimately. Machines that had already survived worse than any standoff. As years passed, the Sherman's presence became symbolic. Seeing one in service suggested resilience and pragmatism. It meant a nation valued what worked over what impressed. In some regions, the tank became a political signal, its origin and continued use reflecting alliances and dependencies. The Sherman had started as a weapon of total war, but now it existed within the subtle language of diplomacy and deterrence. American crews, watching from afar, sometimes felt conflicted. The tank they associated with youth and terror was still out there, serving new causes, yet there was pride too. The Sherman represented an idea that endured, that simple, reliable machines could outlast grand designs. It carried American industrial philosophy into foreign doctrines, quietly shaping how wars were prepared for, even when they never came. By the 1960s, newer tanks dominated headlines, but the Sherman remained stubbornly present. It lingered in second-line units, reserve formations, and allied inventories. Its continued service embarrassed some planners and delighted others. Every year it remained active, challenged assumptions about obsolescence. The Sherman refused to disappear simply because something newer existed. It stayed because it still worked. For crews who served in Sherman's decades after World War II, the tank felt almost timeless. They inherited traditions, maintenance habits, and stories passed down from earlier generations. The machine connected them to history in a tangible way. They knew they were sitting inside a veteran, a survivor that had outlived expectations again and again. That knowledge shaped how they treated it, with respect earned through longevity. And so the Sherman rolled through the middle years of the 20th century, fighting some wars, avoiding others, always adapting. It was no longer the centerpiece of armored warfare, but it did not need to be. Its role had changed. It had become a bridge between eras, linking the desperate industrial struggle of World War II with the tense, fragmented conflicts that followed. In doing so, it proved that endings in history are rarely clean, and that some machines, like some stories, refuse to stop when the world expects them to. The end finally came not with an explosion, but with a quiet fading, stretched over decades rather than moments. By the time the Sherman tank began disappearing from active service, the world it had been built for no longer existed. New generations of armored vehicles thundered across training grounds, backgrounds, sleeker, heavier, bristling with technology unimaginable to the engineers of the 1940s. Compared to them, the Sherman looked small, almost humble. Yet even as it stepped aside, it refused to vanish. Instead, it slipped into a final role that might have been its most powerful of all, memory. Across continents, Shermans were slowly withdrawn from frontline units. Some were replaced ceremoniously, crews lining up as newer tanks rolled past, symbols of progress and power. Others were simply parked, drained of fuel, and left behind fences, waiting for paperwork to catch up with reality. The tank that had once been rushed into combat now exited service, slowly, almost politely, as if unwilling to draw attention to itself. It had outlasted expectations so thoroughly that no one quite knew how to say goodbye. Many Shermans found new lives as monuments. Cities that had known war placed them in public squares, on hilltops, or at the gates of old bases. Guns were frozen in place, often angled skyward or toward imagined horizons. Fresh coats of paint hid rust and scars, but not history. Children climbed onto hulls for photographs. Couples sat on tracks during quiet evening. Veterans stood nearby, sometimes touching the steel, sometimes simply looking, their memories louder than any cannon. The Sherman became a focal point, a physical reminder that history was not abstract but heavy and real. Museums claimed others. Curators cleaned them carefully, restoring markings, researching unit history, recreating the way they had looked at specific moments in time. Inside climate-controlled halls, Shermans told curated stories. Plaques explained battles, tactics, and production numbers. Visitors walked around them slowly, surprised by their size, their simplicity, their worn interiors. The tank became educational, a tool for explaining not just war but industry, logistics, and the human cost hidden behind steel. Some Shermans were less fortunate. Left in remote bases, jungles, deserts, or islands, they slowly surrendered to nature. Rust bloomed across armor plate, plants grew through open hatches, tracks sank into earth. These forgotten tanks became ghosts of conflict, rediscovered decades later by hikers, historians, or satellite images. Photographs of rusted Shermans half swallowed by the environment spread fascination and sadness. Even abandoned, the tank commanded attention. Its presence asked questions about time, neglect, and the long shadows cast by war. A few Shermans continued working in civilian roles long after military retirement. Stripped of weapons, they pushed earth, cleared obstacles, or hauled heavy loads in construction projects. Their engines still turned, their tracks still bit into ground. In these jobs, the tank's violent past felt distant. It became a machine of labor, contributing quietly to rebuilding rather than destruction. The idea that a weapon of war could help shape peace felt strangely appropriate, as if the Sherman itself was trying to balance its own history. As decades passed, the Sherman's image shifted. Once criticized during the war for its vulnerabilities, it now benefited from hindsight. Historians reassessed its role, emphasizing its reliability, adaptability, and sheer availability. They argued that wars are not won by perfect machines, but by ones that arrive on time, in numbers, and keep working under impossible conditions. In that context, the Sherman's legacy grew stronger with age. What had once been seen as compromise became evidence of wisdom. Veterans aged alongside the tanks. As they passed away, their stories became more precious. Interviews, memoirs, and recordings often mentioned the Sherman not as an abstract vehicle but as a companion. Crews named their tanks, cursed them, relied on them, and sometimes owed their lives to them. These personal connections transformed the tank from hardware into something almost human. When the veterans were gone, the Shermans remained, standing in their place as silent witnesses. In popular culture, the Sherman gained a second life. Films, documentaries, and books brought it back into public consciousness. Model builders recreated it in miniature. Video games placed players inside its steel shell. Each portrayal shaped how new generations understood the tank. While no representation was perfect, together they kept the Sherman alive in imagination. It became the default image of an Allied tank, a visual shorthand for an entire era. Collectors and restorers took on the challenge of preservation. Some Shermans were returned to running condition, engines rebuilt, tracks replaced, guns rendered safe. Seeing a Sherman move under its own power decades after its creation stirred something deep in spectators. The sound of its engine, the clatter of its tracks, felt like time folding in on itself. These restored tanks did not glorify war. They demonstrated endurance, craftsmanship, and the tangible reality of history. As the 21st century advanced, the Sherman's meaning continued to evolve. Fewer people had direct connections to World War II. The tank increasingly served as a bridge between lived memory and recorded history. It helped anchor stories that might otherwise drift into abstraction. Standing beside a Sherman made the scale of war clearer, the effort more tangible. It reminded observers that history involved physical strain, noise, fear, and weight. In some countries, Shermans became symbols of national stories distinct from their American origins. Modified, upgraded, and used in local conflicts, they were woven into regional narratives of survival, independence, or struggle. The tank's adaptability allowed it to belong to many histories at once. It was American by birth, global by service, and universal by legacy. Even rusting Shermans served a purpose. They sparked curiosity. Why was it here? Who used it? What happened around it? Each forgotten hull invited investigation, leading researchers to uncover forgotten battles, units, and human stories. In this way, the tank continued teaching long after its last engine shut down. The Sherman never received a single dramatic farewell. There was no moment when the world collectively decided it was finished. Instead, it slipped gradually from relevance into remembrance, overlapping generations, roles, and meanings. That slow exit suited it. The tank had always been about persistence rather than spectacle, and so the story ends not with silence, but with echoes. The Sherman tank, born of urgency and necessity, lived far beyond its expected span. It fought, trained, built, guarded, rusted, and remembered it. It became scrap and monument, machine and symbol. Long after its guns fell silent, it continued shaping how people understood war, industry, and endurance. The Sherman did not simply survive World War II. It carried that war forward, piece by piece, into the future, reminding the world that history is not something that ends, but something that lingers, heavy and unforgotten, like steel tracks pressed deep into the ground.